Voices Radio.
Voices Radio.
Hello and welcome to I Was Just Wondering with me, Tom Salmon, the show that dives into film, music and games and everything else in between. My guest on this week's episode is the co-founder and the director of the Cinema Museum, Martin Humphries. Hello Martin and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for people who aren't familiar with your work at the Cinema Museum and the role of a museum director, who are you and what do you do?
Okay, well, the Cinema Museum is about the experience of going to the cinema as it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. The exhibition is all to do with interior design, decor and technical equipment from films. And my role as the director, I'm a co-founder, is really to keep the place up and running and try and secure our long-term future. We've been going since 1984. We became a charity in 1986. We moved into our current building, which is a wonderful Victorian building called the Master's House, in 1998. And we're based in Kennington or close to Elephant and Castle.
Okay, so now before we jump into the history, as you've sort of briefly mentioned, and the community around the Cinema Museum and the day-to-day running of it, I'd like you to cast your mind back to your earliest memory of going to the cinema. Where was that cinema and what did you see?
Well, my earliest memory of going to the cinema is... There's two possibilities here. This is a long time ago. I'm 67 now, and I would have been about 12.
Okay.
Either I went to the village hall in Portishead, where I was brought up, on a Saturday morning for Saturday morning pictures, because there was a man and a van and a 16mm projector who would come every Saturday, and he would show films for the kids in the morning and then films for the adults in the evening.
Right.
The other alternative is that I cycled to Clevedon, which is 7 miles away, and had a wonderful little cinema. And I can only imagine that whatever the film was, which I don't actually remember, was something suitable for kids.
And about that particular experience, what was it about it that really caught your imagination instead of all the different art forms of, say, like music, art? What was it particularly about cinema that really sort of caught your attention? Can you remember that particular time?
Well, the atmosphere, being in a shared space with other people, enjoying a film, reacting to it emotionally, laughing possibly with it, or being frightened by it, or being charmed by it, or whatever. It's a community experience. It's like theatre, which is another one of my loves, and it's important it's done with a live audience. I think the cinematic experience of watching a film with an audience is fabulous.
Yeah, there is something very special about that adds as like a third or fourth dimension to actually seeing a film when you're in a packed audience, even though it's silent, it's full of strangers. There's something very special about that. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a very hard question now, and it's a question I'm not sure I can answer myself. What's your favourite film which you first saw at the cinema?
Well, that, of course, from someone like me, is an impossible question. I probably have 10 favourite films today and 10 different favourite films tomorrow.
It's the same for me. It's the same for me, to be honest. I
mean, I do have films that I really love. I love The Red Shoes by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, which I did see in the cinema. It would have been a revival at the NFT, I think. There's a wonderful Andrei Tarkovsky film called Mirror. He was a very, very interesting Russian film director, long dead now, who made very, very strange but interesting films. And then I love things like screwball comedies from the 1930s. And late silent films. I prefer to early silent films generally. I love thrillers, film noir, just a whole range of films. And I still go to the cinema today. I saw Downton Abbey the other day. I saw The Northman the other day. I like to try and go not quite once a week, because there's so much going on at the museum. I probably can't carve out the time that frequently. But I think it's very, very important to still be going to cinemas and encouraging other people to do the same. We show a lot of films at the museum,
right,
different types of films, and we get a lot of appreciation from our audiences.
So I just want to sort of do like a quick parallel between two different films, which kind of makes sense to me, may not to you. In terms of silent film, which is sort of a throwback in terms of like, it's not something that's widely watched now. But and even back then, even though you started watching cinema, I guess like sort of 50s sort of time, like when you're like a child, would have been that sort of time maybe?
Well, I was born in 55, so
60.
I wouldn't have seen anything until the early 60s.
So early 60s. So even then, when you were basically going through film, even to go look back at silent films, that would have been a way sort of like back.
Yes, I probably didn't see a silent film until I was in my 20s.
Right.
To be honest, because at that time, people didn't... It was a kind of specialisation. It's not like today. Silent films are very, very popular today.
Right.
You'd be very surprised. We have silent film screenings every 3 weeks. That's the Kennington Bioscope with live music, usually piano. They're packed.
Right.
Absolutely packed. There's an enormous amount of interest being shown over the last 30 plus years. There are 2 film festivals devoted only to silent film. There's also 2 festivals in Britain that deal with silent film. It's really made a comeback in terms of the richness of that experience. I mean, it's quite difficult introducing young people to silent films because you have to learn to adjust.
Right.
You know, the mores are different, the style of acting is different. So sometimes people laugh when it's inappropriate.
Right.
So usually a silent film screening has an introduction by somebody who knows the film very well, and they can point out anything that might be anachronistic or in today's moral values would not be appropriate.
Yeah.
You know, you have to contextualise stuff.
Yeah, of course.
But that experience of going to the cinema with other people, whether it's silent or sound or what it is a unique experience, I think.
It is. So just following on from that question, just doing my research, like cinema has always been like a working class entertainment since 1895 when the Lumiere brothers set up the cinematograph to project short films for paying audiences at the Café Grand. I mean, it really is about sitting in a dark auditorium in silence, full of strangers, watching stories told through moving images, which have basically enthralled multiple generations and still continue to do so. And I was just thinking, actually, in terms of the progress of, say, from silent film to today, there was a lot of progress made through sound design, projection, and production. But I just wonder what your feeling is. Have you reached a sort of bottleneck in terms of cinema? Because I guess like the zenith, you would say, in terms of popular sort of cinema at the moment would be like Avatar 2, which they've spent $1 billion on. They've spent like 15 years making the thing. Have we reached the point where cinemas, I guess like technically speaking, has reached a point where it can't innovate anymore?
No, I don't think so at all. The range of films that's available to people is incredibly wide. Now, there was a period where it seemed that the Hollywood film studios were only interested in audiences, mostly of men, aged 16 to 24, with the product that they were pushing out. That's changed. There's a much wider range. I think they cottoned on when they realised that quite a few art house films did it incredibly well with older audiences. Like 45 Years, for example, which really captured something about people's lives through Tom Courtenay being this man revisiting his past.
Right.
If you think about the number of cinemas, there are mainstream cinemas, you know, like the Odeons and all of that, who show the blockbusters, the Marvel films and everything like that. But there's also the independents, the picture houses, the Everyman. And whilst they also show, you know, the Northman was being shown at Picture House, they also show art house films and smaller films. They encourage young filmmakers as well in terms of what they're doing. And they provide opportunities for people. I mean, it's always been difficult to break into the film industry. And at one time, if your dad was working in the industry, you would end up with a job in the industry.
Right.
But it's still difficult today for young filmmakers. You know, they're hoping to make a short film that people will latch onto, that will lead to the possibility of them being able to make maybe a longer film, possibly a feature or whatever. But it's still a challenge for people to get into the industry. And I mean, even well-established directors can struggle to get their next project off the ground if their previous project has not been as financially successful as the studios hoped. Then they won't greenlight your next one. If you're very successful and you have a blockbuster, I mean, Christopher Nolan, you know, open door for him, I expect. It just varies and it depends. I mean, at the museum, we try and do Q&As with people from the film industry talking about their career in front of the screen and behind the screen. So we have directors, costume designers, actors coming along and doing that. We also put on very popular events which are reminiscence events about pioneering television series. We had a whole afternoon and evening devoted to The Bill, you know, the long-running police series. Absolutely jam-packed. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that lots of people love these old TV programs and would come just to hear people talking about what it was like working on them, what kind of relationships they had, and then they can do, you know, they can get their photos signed and all that kind of thing. So we do a whole range of events.
So I just want to jump back in time a bit. So now I understand you met your partner and co-founder of the Cinema Museum, Ronald Grant, in Brixton in the early 1980s.
Not quite.
Okay.
Not quite right. It was 1979.
Okay.
I was at that time working at Oval House Arts and Community Centre. I was the kind of centre manager.
Yeah.
And on a Sunday, we would open the cafe at lunch because we often ran workshops on Sunday afternoons. Ronald would come in from the Oxfordshire countryside where he lived at that time, and he would do a stint with London Friend, which was, you know, a place where people would ring up if they had a problem.
Oh, okay, right.
So, and because he's a night owl, he would do the night shift. Well, it's obviously more difficult to find people willing to do the night shift than the day shift. So after he finished, which would be at some time in the morning, he would come down to Oval House basically for his breakfast.
Right.
And we got talking, realised that we were attracted to one another and started seeing each other.
Yeah.
Now, he already had an extraordinary collection of cinema memorabilia because he's 20 years older than me. He went into the cinema industry as an apprentice projectionist when he was 15. And this was in Aberdeen. And the apprenticeship took 5 years for him to become a chief projectionist. If you're in the business, it's much easier to collect things to do with that business. So by the time I met him, he had an extraordinary collection of film stills, posters, books, magazines, equipment, cinema seats. I was astonished that somebody could have all this material, which was actually stored in Brixton, not far from the Ritzy Cinema, in fact. Now, at this time, many high street cinemas were being demolished. There were a lot of changes going on in the cinema business, in that these beautiful Art Deco cinemas with 1,000 seats were not really suitable now. Some of the cinemas had been converted into smaller screens. That didn't really work because the sound would leak and all that. So these buildings were difficult. We understand that. And also they were on prime high street sites, so their real estate value was high.
Yeah.
We discovered if we offered the demolition men beer money, they would let us in. We could take anything we wanted because they didn't care. They were going to destroy it.
Right.
So for a 5-year period, we very seriously rescued many items from cinemas that are no longer here. We also acquired from his old company in Aberdeen a very large amount of material, and it was the acquisition of this material from Aberdeen, which was really good quality. Uniforms, carpets, seat fabrics, projectors, light fittings, incredible.
Yeah.
That was the tipping point for the creation of the museum, because we now had so much material, we thought we must make it publicly available to people. And initially, because the building we were in was not suitable for public access, it was mostly small rooms in an old Georgian building, we would have a touring exhibition, and we had loaned items to other museums, like the Museum of the Moving Image, which was on the South Bank, long gone now. Then in 1986 we became a charity with a board of trustees, and basically the job of the board of trustees was to find a way of relocating the collection into better premises. That turned out to be the old fire station in Renfrew Road, which is just round the corner from our current building. Much better. People could come and do research, people could come and see some of the collection. It wasn't really open access, it was by appointment rather than anything else. And then in 1998 we moved into our current building, where we were able to display the collection for the first time in a way that tells a story. People can come in, they can go round. Generally I advise people a guided tour is better because it's more informative. Because we're not a museum where you can go around with an iPod and listen. You know, the exhibits talk to you yet. I mean, maybe in the future that will happen, but currently it's me or one of the other volunteers taking people around and talking about the collection and what there is and how it was used and how it worked and all that kind of thing. So it really engages people. I mean, obviously for people, 50 plus, it's bringing back their memories of cinema going. Because one of the things that happened in life generally was, when you were an adolescent and a young person, you would go to the cinema, you would take your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, but once you got married and had children, that completely changed it. Because if you were going to the cinema, you needed a babysitter. Maybe you couldn't afford a babysitter. So people's cinema-going habits, once they got together, would change. And then, of course, once your children were old enough, you might start going back to the cinema because you didn't need babysitters and things anymore. You could just go off, and if there was something on that you fancied, you could go and see it. And there was, I would say, until probably the 1980s, a very wide range of possible films to go and see. From westerns to romantic comedies to serious dramas to thrillers to whatever. It kind of narrowed a bit, really, in the 80s and 90s. And then it expanded in the 2000s, and now I think it's very, very rich in terms of the possibilities of what you can go and see. And that's good and to be encouraged, very much so, I would say.
So I just wanted to jump a little further back, just going back to the newsletter which I spoke to just before, about the 1985 newsletter. It was talking about the Board of Trustees, and it was also talking about I think it was the Eros Cinema in Piccadilly Circus, which had been closed, and also, I'm not going to pronounce this right, but is it Toaster? There was another cinema. It was
Toaster.
That's the one, Toaster. Where a lot of these artefacts came from. And what it made me think about, because in the newsletter it describes about being able to get certain objects but not being able to get others due to a lack of funds. So you can't save everything. So in terms of and that's sort of a question in terms of what do you pick and choose? What is the things do you feel that are most valuable versus others? How do you make that difficult decision?
This will be for when I've gone and other people are running the museum. It's very common that museum founders are terrible at saying no. Right. Okay, if you did research on this, I think you would probably discover that every museum founder, in terms of collecting objects, would find it very difficult to say no to anything. We are very bad at saying no when people offer us things. We do get offers of donations. Today, for example, in the post arrived a box with about 15 diaries where this person had recorded every single film they'd seen and what they thought about it.
Oh, wow.
And we have a collection of this kind of material. So I was thrilled to accept that because we can add it to the... And in fact, there was a project pre-COVID where two young men were researching things like people doing diaries, keeping records of their thoughts and feelings about film, and from that they created an exhibition at Birkbeck, which was really, really good, very powerful, I have to say. There are things we turn down. We won't accept, there are a lot of film magazines we won't accept now because they're impossible to get rid of. Every cinema enthusiast seems to have a collection of sight and sound, so that's definitely a no. Please remember that. But there are always other things coming up where it's interesting. You know, somebody's got home movies. Would we like those? Yes, we would. Thank you very much. Or they might have some artifact that they've also rescued from a cinema, but they don't want anymore.
Right.
So we do get offered things in that way. I mean, one of the most recent donations, strangely enough, is Colin Firth's Armani suit from Supernova.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which the film production company contacted me, said, would we like it to put it on display? And I said yes, because whilst we have cinema uniforms on display, we don't have a huge amount of material that relates to film specifically.
Right, yeah.
And I thought, well, how can I turn this down? You know, and there it is. It's in our foyer now, next to the box office.
Yeah. With
a little note about what it is and a poster of Supernova. And I was thrilled to accept that. So what will happen is we are in the process of on what's called on the road for museum accreditation. This can take quite a long time. But basically, you have to develop policies in every area that you can possibly think of. So there'll be an ecological policy, there'll be a staff policy, blah, blah, blah. And one of them is a collections policy.
Right.
What the museum will collect and why, what it won't collect, what it won't take in anymore. So the generation after me will be much firmer at saying, this is not suitable for the museum.
Yeah.
And they will also probably be much better at disposals. I mean, we do... In order to raise funds for the museum, one of the things we do is we do sell duplicate items. If we've got duplicate posters, for example, if you go on our website, there is a website shop. We sell books, we sell stills, we sell magazines. This is one of the many income strands that we run, because being an independent museum, you basically have to have as many different income streams as you can possibly generate.
Right.
So it's not just the events, but it's private hires of the building. It might be it's doing educational work with people. We do a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, there's LCC at Elephant and Castle, so obviously they're a natural university for us to work with, which we do. And there's also South Bank University and Westminster and De Montfort University in Leicester, where we all have these relationships with. And that's another thing that's really, really important, that the museum develops relationships with the local community, with lots of other organisations, so that you have reciprocal events going on. We promote other people's events. We ask other people to promote our events.
Yeah.
You know, it's all about establishing yourself as part of a network, which is being very, very supportive of one another. That's an important element, I would say.
And so going back to when you set up the museum in like 1984, and I think we spoke briefly just outside actually about there being smaller museums that are collecting different film-related items, maybe some are more specific with sound equipment. How many of those have sort of survived and thrived alongside the Cinema Museum?
Now there is the museum in Bradford, which is film, photography, television and digital. There's what was the Bill Douglas collection in Exeter as part of the university, which I believe is now called the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum.
Right.
In Scotland, there's a film archive which does do some exhibition-related work. That's probably it. I mean, there is a thriving... excuse me. network of film archives.
Right.
You know, there's the northwest, northeast. There's one down in the West Country. There's one in Brighton. They would all be communicating with one another, doing projects, and basically rescuing film. Mm-hmm. So, but going back to 1985, the most notable thing that happened in relationship to the British cinema industry was the introduction of the multiplex. And this was the Point in Milton Keynes. I believe it was a Canadian company.
Oh, it was an American, AMC.
AMC.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this was like 10 screens?
It was, yeah. Yeah.
This was really radical and innovative. The idea that you could go to a cinema with plenty of parking, you had this incredible choice of 10 films, although later on, sometimes they'd use 2 screens to do the same film.
Yeah.
If it was Star Wars or something. Now, cinema was really in the doldrums then. Declining audiences, apart from, I suspect, art house cinema, but in terms of high street cinemas. So this came like a bolt of lightning out of the blue, was very successful, and of course then you suddenly saw multiplexes mushrooming around the country. I mean, there's quite a few in London, where that possibility of choice, ease of access, food, which has changed significantly in the cinema now. I mean, if you go to an Everyman, you can actually have a meal.
You can, yeah.
Which
a few
I
cocktails
feel
before.
is a rather bizarre. The idea of watching the film and eating your dinner at the same time, I can't quite get my head around that. But the idea that you would go and it's not only popcorn, it's not only cheap fizzy drinks, but, you know, it's more sophisticated. You could go, you could get a decent drink, you could get a decent snack. This all added to the cinema experience.
Yeah.
And that's what lots of pioneering cinemas do. They like to try out these different things. I mean, in the Everyman in Portobello Road, I believe it's sofas that you can sit in.
Yeah.
Well, that's very different from sitting in cinema seats, which might be a bit uncomfortable, depending on your size. So they have to be looking at new ideas, fresh ideas, you know, what's going to attract people. And we have to do the same thing in terms of our programming.
Right.
I mean, some of the volunteers at the museum program some of the seasons that are there. I get approaches from people asking if it's possible to do an event. I was emailing about a queer horror event that's coming up in July, I think, a double bill. Well, that will be a 50-50 box office split with a guarantee to the museum of a minimum amount, and I'm happy to try it.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing them already at the Castle Cinema, which I don't actually know, and they're very popular, but we would be a bigger venue for them, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to try this. When people come to me, if the idea sounds good, I'll organise it, we'll book a date, we'll make the arrangements, and we'll try it out. If it doesn't succeed, then either we don't pursue it,
Yeah.
or we might think, well, this needs a bit of nurturing. There is an audience for it, we've got to find them. Where are they? Not everything works, but you have to be prepared to try. We've been running a series of older European films, which, generally speaking, would not have been seen on the big screen for many, many years. We have not been able to find the audience for that. We've not been able to tap into who are the people who would come and see these films. Whereas the film noir seasons, packed. Had a really loyal audience for that.
Yeah.
You know, people who come to everyone if they possibly can, and so on. So you just have to try all these different things.
So just picking up on the point you made about queer cinema.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting in terms of like collecting this archive along with all these different films. I just wonder in terms of like the coming from, say, from say like the 60s through to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s in terms of queer cinema, in terms of even obtaining those particular films to show, and even that community. How has that been for you moving through that space, and has that opened up more?
Yes, it has. Pre-COVID, we, in collaboration with a group of other people, we created what was called the Vito Project. This was based on Vito Rosso, a wonderful American film critic who wrote a book exploring images of homosexuality in Hollywood cinema. And so we based the series of screenings on the films he talks about in his book so that we could have a discussion after it. Was very successful. COVID put the hat on that, but Vito has come back.
Right.
So we're showing Compulsion, which is a very interesting 50s film. We showed Tea and Sympathy. Now, these are films that have gay themes or elements in them, but it's before homosexuality was legalised.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting avenue to look at. When we did the Vito Project before, we would actually do very contemporary films because we wanted to show films that had trans-related issues. We wanted to show, obviously, films that were women-focused. And we're now running a season called Sappho, which is films that have some kind of lesbian-related content. We do another season, which is called Women and Cocaine, which is about pre-code, strong female actresses like Joan Crawford, Betty Davis, Katharine Hepburn, and so on, in the films that cover the cusp of the freedom that people had pre the Hollywood Code, and then the realities of the Hollywood Code being introduced and the films becoming more saccharine, really. So those strands are really important. And, of course, you want to create safe spaces for people to see the films in. That's very important.
So growing up and navigating that sort of space, was that an issue for you when you wanted to engage with like queer cinema in terms of having a safe space and an outlet for you?
Well, when I was growing up, yes. I mean, what did you see on television? Rubbish, Mr. Humphries from that terrible sitcom.
Oh my God, yeah.
Ghastly stereotypes. And generally speaking, in the cinema, there wasn't much. I mean, Midnight Cowboy was a revelation, really. And John Schlesinger, of course, was a gay man. But finding positive depictions of lesbians and gay men was really quite difficult. And, of course, a lot of people struggled with that because all they saw in relationship to themselves was negativity. Now, I have been very lucky in that I've been very comfortable with my sexuality since I was about 15. But that isn't always people's experience. Some families find it very difficult when their child comes out. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to connect. They don't really understand it. That can make it difficult for people. So whilst we've made many, many, many strides, I mean, gay marriage, for example, and the civil partnerships was fantastic. And nowadays it's much more recognised that it's part of a spectrum people are on, and, homophobia is to be batted away as much as possible, please. And all that kind of stuff. But there are still young people who do find it difficult. They're not seeing enough, or they don't have access to enough. I mean, television has significantly improved, I have to say, particularly, in the alternative channels that show stuff, which we wouldn't have had before. But now, generally speaking, it's pretty good.
Okay, cool. So I'd just like to sort of move on to the Cinema Museum itself. So we briefly sort of spoke about it, but it's basically a very historic building. It was the old workhouse built in 1871, which silent film star Charlie Chaplin, his mother and his brother Sidney unfortunately worked in to save themselves from being homeless. So I think we talked about it sort of briefly a little bit, but what was your journey to discovering that building in the middle of Lambeth Castle?
We were round the corner in the old fire station. This was a building that was owned by Lambeth Council because it had been a housing office. They were happy to have us as a tenant because they had a problem with a sitting tenant. There were 14 flats up above. But They had resolved that problem by 1997 and they put the building on the market. Fortunately, the property developer who bought it wasn't ready to do any redevelopment for a year, so we had an extra year to look. During that time, Ronald went with Anna Odrick, who's a local artist and one of the long-standing volunteers at the museum. They went on a Charlie Chaplin walk, which I've always found this very odd, but the walk around Kennington ended up at the workhouse.
Right.
And it seemed very odd to me that in terms of all the places Chaplin was in Kennington, to end a walk at a place where he must have been miserable and unhappy and psychologically disturbed seemed very odd. Anyway, the building appeared to be empty. So we contacted the NHS who owned it at that time. They were a smaller trust than they became. And we spoke to the capital planning manager and he said, well, we're not thinking of renting the building out, but keep in touch with me. We have commissioned a report to see whether it would be possible to convert this building into a headquarters building.
Yeah.
Fortunately, that report said it would be far too expensive. The building was Victorian, it wouldn't be suitable to be a headquarters building for the NHS. And once that had been completed, the next time we contacted him, he said, come and talk to me.
Yeah.
And we went and saw him, we agreed terms, we moved in February 1998.
Okay.
Now, we tried to buy the building from South London and Maudsley NHS Trust, who became the owners through the amalgamation of 3 separate NHS trusts. That didn't succeed. In the end, they decided to put the whole site, that's our building and an ex-nursing home next door that is on quite a lot of land, to the highest bidder. However, we managed to persuade them, because we had been in negotiation with them, that they put in a condition of sale that whoever the new owner was, that they should try and ensure the long-term future of the museum, or they should take that on as a commitment. We have now successfully negotiated with Anthology / Life Story, who are our landlords,
Right.
that we are on a 4-year lease, which is meant to give us time to fundraise to find the premium, which will allow us to have a 999-year lease at Peppercorn. Now, what we have to do in the next 4 years, we have to raise a minimum of £1 million for the lease.
Right.
We would like to try and raise more than that, because the building needs work doing on it, plus we have development plans. So watch this space, folks, because there will be announcements being made. We will be going to supporters of the museum asking if they can help. We hope to go to the Arts Council and the Heritage Lottery, any other funders that we can approach and find. And we will also do a crowdfunding campaign.
Right.
So that people who love the museum but perhaps don't have huge amounts of money, can give us £20, £50, £100 or whatever, whereas we'll be going to other people and trying to seek larger amounts of money to see if they are willing to pledge that money. And then if we succeed, we'll get the money, and then we can acquire the long lease. Fingers crossed, everybody.
And so why is it so important that the Cinema Museum and places like it stay open?
Well, it's really, really important that you have a wide range of museums, of educational institutions, of cinemas, of theatres. The much choice you can get, the better. And the thing with museums like the Cinema Museum, we're a small independent museum, entirely volunteer run at the moment, that we specialise. And it's very important to have those kind of museums alongside the British Museum, which is amazing, of course, and Victoria and Albert and all of that. But these smaller museums that cater possibly for elements of people's lives, they really can enrich you. I mean, the people who came on the tour today were, all 3 of them were very, very enthusiastic at the end. You know, they'd had a really interesting morning. They'd been able to contribute to in terms of the discussion. So we we were all talking amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
They weren't just listening to me. Those kind of experiences are really important, and people will pass them on. They'll say,
Yeah.
"Oh, I went to this really interesting museum, blah, blah, you should look it up, go to the website
Yeah.
and find it," and all that.
In 2018, you did win Time Out's Most Loved Local Cultural Spot Award.
We've won it twice, actually.
Oh, you've won it twice?
We've won it twice.
So when was it? So 2018, and then what was the other time?
When was the other one? 19? Or maybe it was 20 before
Oh,
COVID.
yeah, that's right, yes.
20 before
Yeah,
COVID.
yeah.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, this is people voting for it. It's not... They're not being canvassed. Time Out just invites people to come and you tell them what your favourite X, Y and Z is.
Right.
So it's really a loving award. And we were thrilled, I have to say.
And what's been the lasting impact of winning that award twice?
Well, it certainly boosted our audiences.
Right.
Because of the publicity we got surrounding it, which was very, very good. Because there weren't only articles in Time Out. Some of the other newspapers and magazines picked it up.
Yeah.
And wanted to run with it. So it got us noticed.
Right.
That's the importance of these things when they happen.
Yeah.
About 10 years ago, we won a Volunteers Award, which was part of the museum industry,
Right.
and we had to go to an awards ceremony. And, of course, that was really saying to our volunteers, "You're wonderful, you're very skilled, and as a result, you've won this award." They created a special award for us.
Nice.
Which was really, really good.
And I believe in 2021 you won a Film Heritage Award, I believe.
Yes.
According to my scribble notes, it was a Jean, I forget what the surname is.
The Jean Mitry
That's the one, it was...
Now, this is the equivalent of being given an Oscar.
right.
This is an award which is given by the Giannate del Cinema Muto in Italy. They're based in Pordenone, north of Venice. It's a silent film festival. It's been running as long as we have, I think. And Ronald and I used to go every year, and it lasts a week. They show silent films from early in the morning until late at night.
Yeah.
And they have this very, very prestigious Jean Mitry Award, which their board of trustees decides who to give it to. We were chosen
Right.
for our work of creating the museum, keeping it up and running. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to the awards ceremony, but Ronald did.
Yeah.
He made a very, very moving speech, which you can see on YouTube, and we were given this delightful award. And I can't tell you the kind of level of respect and acknowledgement that means, because it's your peers in the same industry recognizing the quality of what you've managed to achieve. Superb. I mean, it was really cherry on the top.
And it's not the thing I sort of take away from this whole experience is like it's never been easy, and you've always been fighting.
Yeah.
So I guess like in terms of like what, because so awards are a great sort of like point of like, yeah, I've achieved this great thing, but through those sort of more stressful like darker times, what's kept you motivated to keep on trucking and pursue this?
Well, I love what I do.
Yeah.
I really do love what I do.
And where do you think that like comes from? What?
Well, I've always been into the arts.
Yeah.
When I was younger, and I thought I would end up in theatre, which I did very briefly, I never expected I would co-found a cinema museum and be running it.
Yeah.
But I have loved it really from day one, in the sense of when we created it, it meant that we could start opening up. And that was the really important thing, to make the collection accessible, available to people. It's so interesting because it's social history, it's entertainment, it's about the historical experience.
Yeah.
It's to do with film, which is an alluring industry anyway. I've met really fascinating and interesting people over the years. It's richly rewarding, actually. So it may have been stressful, which it was, certainly at the moments when we didn't have a lease, and we had no idea if we were going to be closed down or not. I can definitely do without that.
Yeah.
But, to see it being successful, seeing how important it is to so many people, that is a reward in itself. Because I have to say, when Ronald and I started, there was a bit of, well, who are these bonkers people?
Yeah.
Old bits of old cinema and old seats. Well, what's all that? Well, there's been a complete change round. We don't get that attitude from anybody anymore, because they can see what we've achieved. We're not just two eccentric men with a lot of cinema artifacts. We've managed to create something that's meaningful, that's important to people, that is celebrated, and we've spent a lot of time creating links to the local communities around us, different types of groups of people, so that, in a sense, the museum is like a rich fruitcake.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a very hard question now. So what's your item you treasure the most, and which is the item you treasure the least in terms of things that you've...
Okay. There are many things I love in the museum, particularly the Art Deco design of everything. That's a constant pleasure. But my most favourite object is a Felix the Cat toy from 1924. Felix the Cat was a very naughty cat who appeared in lots of very short animated films. He was delightful and entrancing, and merchandising in the cinema has always gone hand in hand. People would be very surprised, I think, to realise that lots of silent films, they would merchandise stuff off the back of it.
Oh, wow, I didn't realise that.
So he's a little wooden toy. He's got one of those bases that if you push with your thumb, he goes all floppy.
Right.
He's delightful. But I also love lots of the other things in the collection. The things I am less keen on, and actually we don't really have much on display, is plastic.
Right.
Because unfortunately, one of the things that happened with cinemas was that they changed all these beautiful Art Deco signages, display boards, and they replaced them with plastic. That's not very interesting to us. But we do have some examples, but they're in the basement.
That's an interesting point. So as people move forward and continue to archive cinema and cinemas, although it's changed drastically, so I guess so it goes to 2000 and 100 or something, and people are looking back at, say, sort of cinema, and I say the mid 2000s and stuff. What do you think is going to kind of be left, or even be left, because it's so disposable now?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer, because there's no way I can anticipate what technological advances there are going to be. I mean, people already watch films in many, many different ways, from tablets to phones to iPads to televisions to going to the cinema themselves. Whether the technology will be moving more and more towards people individually watching films, which is certainly one road that is possible. My hope is that because there's been a revival, not helped by COVID, I have to say, but there has been a revival of people wanting to have a communal experience of going to the cinema. If that can be maintained, if that experience can be passed down through the generations, then I think cinema as a communal experience has a healthy future. But it is a question mark.
So just following on from that last point, do you think the current government and the Arts Council is doing enough to develop and protect local cultural hotspots and businesses in a post-pandemic world?
Not the government, no. I think they've behaved abominably in terms of supporting the arts. They were terrible in terms of supporting theatre, which was in real struggle, and I mean, I know some have closed. Cinemas also suffered a lot during the pandemic. They went open, they weren't getting income. I I don't know what support was offered. I mean, we applied for everything we possibly could, but we only got one grant from the Art Fund, who've been amazing and wonderful and fabulous to us. You know, lots of people really struggled, and I don't think the government took on the right level of responsibility for the arts, and they still haven't.
And so what do you think that they could do on a proactive level, say like today?
More money.
Right, more money.
More money, and make it so it's not so bureaucratic to get. I mean, I absolutely understand that you need to have processes where it's determined that people's applications are right. I mean, one of the problems with some of the COVID funding money, there was fraud. So obviously you want to put into place things that would prevent that. But really, the hurdles that people have to jump through sometimes make it very, very difficult. And I think there should be some examination of ways in which organisations, maybe only applying for relatively smallish amounts of money, don't have to go through so many hurdles and hoops.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if it's a huge grant, then yes, that does need to be tracked thoroughly, and obviously all the right T's have to be crossed and I's dotted and all the rest of it. But I do think there could be much more funding for the arts if the government was so minded.
Yeah, I agreed. So I've got a few more questions. Just quickly, what is your dream project if money and time wasn't an issue?
My dream project?
Yeah.
If money and time was not an issue. Well, my dream project would be to do the redevelopment of the museum. We have a yard at the back which we could cover with a green roof. That means the whole exhibition could be on the ground floor. That makes it very user-friendly. It's completely accessible. We could use the main hall on the first floor, as we do currently for events, but it could be a less crowded room, possibly, in terms of the artifacts that is in it. So I'd like to see that development of the museum. That would make my heart glow. I think if I retired, is that ever going to happen? But if I retired, I think my dream would be probably to be hopping around the world, going to film festivals.
Right. Yeah, nice. Very nice. Sort of jump back into the collection in your archive. Is there an idea, you sort of talked about it briefly, in terms of like loaning out your collection to other museums and stuff? Does that happen?
Yeah, we do. We've currently got a loan to Birmingham Museum. They have a big exhibition which opened a couple of weeks ago, I think.
Yeah.
And that includes some items from the museum and a lot of photographs of Birmingham cinemas.
Yeah.
I like doing loans to people. It helps bring our profile up, and the fact that people can come to us. We also offer research facilities because, you know, we have 10,000 books to do with cinema. We have a room full of trade and fan magazines. We have a room that's full of photographs of cinemas, interiors, exteriors. There's always people doing research.
Yeah.
And we really encourage people to come to us. We like to find out if they've been to other places first.
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't really be the first port of call for a research project, except when people know that we have something that's not available somewhere else.
Right.
And we do. We have a trade magazine called the Cinema News and Property Gazette. We have a complete run, apart from one half volume in 1916, and that ran from 1911 to 1972. Now, trade magazines are essential for people who are researching the history of cinema, because they have so much detail.
Yeah.
You know, it's not only what the cinemas showed and the reviews of the film, it's stuff to do with the industry and the changes in the industry and all of that. So it's an important resource, and I feel we should offer that to people. We contribute to exhibitions. We're doing a co-production project with an Italian photographer called Francesco. That's happening at the Casa de Cinema, and next year it'll be happening at the museum. And that's a photographic exhibition to do with volunteers. and why.
Right.
And what they get out of it.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So
Well, just sort of touching on that briefly, because you haven't really sort of spoken about the volunteers. How many volunteers do you have in total at the moment?
I think there's approximately 60.
Right.
They vary quite a lot. Some of them are behind the scenes volunteers, and others are front of house volunteers. So it's a range.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we like to do is we like to have people who can be part of a focus group.
Right.
So we'll go to people who are experts and say, look, we'd like to have a couple of meetings talking about this element. How do we make the museum more green and ecological?
Okay, yeah.
So we'd go and find some people who are on the ecological side and probably have 2 or 3 meetings with them about how we can pull together a plan over time, which means that we would be a green or a greener museum.
Yeah.
I like that way of working because you've got people with knowledge and expertise who are contributing, and it means that the museum is in development. It's not in stasis.
Yeah.
And that's an important part of it, that you must have ambitions, you must have plans for the future. Even if they don't happen, those connections can be very important.
Yeah.
It's another way of working with people, and the museum's very much about working with people.
So we've definitely got a real big community vibe. So who is the longest serving volunteer you've got in your books at the moment?
Anna Aldrich.
Yeah.
She was possibly our first volunteer, and this would have been before we moved to the Master's House. It was slightly complicated in the old fire station because we weren't being so public. The moment we moved into the Master's House and realised that we could now do a programme of events, we definitely knew we needed to expand the volunteer pool, because we need people who can run the bar, the cafe. We need technical people. We have a wonderful head of technology called Phil Clark. I'm very pleased with the passion that the volunteers have for the museum and the collection.
And lastly, where can people check out the Cinema Museum, support the fundraising campaign to help buy the building, follow on social media, and also possibly volunteer?
Yeah. Okay, well, we have a website, www.cinemamuseum.org.uk. That will have, you can join up for the newsletter. There's lots of information about the museum, lots of information about our future plans and hopes. There will be information going onto the website about the fundraising campaign. There isn't anything quite there yet, but maybe in a month's time there'll be something that's coming up. There is information about the leases and how that works, how they're intertwined with one another. There is also a volunteer at cinemamuseum.org.uk email button that you can press. I have to say the volunteering opportunities at the museum are generally speaking rather routine. So anybody who's thinking that they might be working with the collection, that's really rather unlikely. But obviously people come for the atmosphere and the enjoyment. And also, if you're a volunteer, you can attend events, of course. That's a plus point for it. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Twitter is at Cinema Museum, I believe. Other people look after the social media, but yes, you can find us. We're there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time this
afternoon
and speaking to me about the Cinema Museum.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.